These questions are in no particular order, but any of you who have complaints about the order, direct them to me because I'm responsible. I'm going to exercise the interlocutor's prerogative and ask the first question. Andres, who were those Indian Masons? Was perhaps one Benjamin Hawkins?
I don't know about Hawkins, but I do know about Richard Fields, chief of the Cherokees, who was incorporated into the Yorkino network before he received his grant on behalf of the Cherokees. So there's at least that one case.
Of Fields?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. The other question that I want someone to tell me the answer to secretly is, what is the York Rite distress sign? But I was afraid of that.
Okay.
Okay, here's a question that I think John Jordan should answer. It's a very good question, very direct, very simple. Why is there so little information in the textbooks about the Texas Navy?
That is an excellent question. I think there are a number of reasons that the Texas Navy naturally and maybe rightly takes second billing, but maybe it shouldn't take the billing that it's been pushed down to. One of them is that we can go see where the Battle of San Jacinto was fought. We can erect a giant obelisk on it, but you can't do that for a naval battle, at least not very often. It's harder to appreciate also the impact of a naval action upon a land-based action when the naval battle really determines the supplies. Logistics are not the kind of thing that are naturally dramatic to us, and so it's a lot harder to so-called connect the dots between something that happens in early April 1836 and something that happens on land several hundred miles away in late April.
A question that perhaps Dr. Almaraz as well as Andres would like to answer, for Archie too perhaps. Explain how Freemasonry could become so strong in Catholic Mexico.
Dr. Almaraz.
I would venture I would venture a guess, since I'm not a Mason, but it would seem that it was more like a fraternal organization, like the generals, for example. Then they had a brotherhood, and therefore they participated there more in pursuing or advancing vested interests rather than going through rituals. Besides, in 19th century Mexico, you had a wave of anti-clericalism. And some individuals, like Valentin Gomez Farias, for example, who, when Santa Anna allowed him to assume the presidency on an acting basis, and he tried to be a good actor, then started persuading the Congress to enact anti-clerical legislation. And he couldn't understand why he would be mistreated on the weekend when the church doors would be shut against him, when he was a good Christian. Now, what he did Monday through Friday, that was a separate matter. And so there's a difference between being anti-clerical and being anti-Catholic.
Does anyone want to add to that?
Since you invited me, I shall. And I will tell you that you may learn everything you wish to learn about Freemasonry by reading the Old Testament. So if you've not done that lately, I encourage you to do that. Freemasonry began in the time of the construction of King Solomon's mine, and that's known as operative Mason, King Solomon's temple. That's known as operative masonry. That's meaning men who make their living building things with stone. In the 17th century, it became speculative masonry. That's men building better lives in various ways. They don't have to actually be stone masons. And I think that has a universal appeal. It's not restricted to, it starts in England, and then it went up to the north, so that's Scottish Rite, and then the part that stayed in the south is York Rite. York Rite comes directly across the Atlantic. Benjamin Franklin was the first deputy Grand Master. Scottish Rite goes over to France, then down to Spain, and as Andre said, down to Mexico, and then fire and fuel get together down here. I think what happens with the coming of the Yorkinos is that you create, as he points out, the machinery for an alternative political arrangement. Men who have pledged to each other to protect secrets with lives can talk about conspiratorial things with regard to the government. I don't think Masonry per se has anything to do with it whatsoever. They are as innocent as I'm hearing us. We get ready to all go see the Da Vinci Code and the Opus Dei says, we're just really nice folks after all. I'm saying to that same degree, Freemasons are very nice folks who have an opportunity, as he points out, to get together and talk to each other.
One of the questions that came up that's related to this is what exactly was Poinsett being asked to do for the Yorkinos?
Oh, okay, that's your...
Okay. Well, there were no formal lodges in Mexico, or rather York Rite lodges in Mexico in 1825. And so I'm not a Mason either, so I don't know how the process works, but you need some formal lodge to sponsor you before you can launch your own formal lodge. And so they knew that Mr. Poinsett was a Mason affiliated with, or at least who had some contacts to the Mason in New York. And so through his offices, he would try to get the regulating patent for that lodge that they were trying to found in Mexico City in 1825. So that's the extent of it. And so the question revolves around whether he did this out of political motives or whether actually the Mexican Yorkinos asked him. And so it makes more sense the latter. I mean, there's always this conspiratorial twist when we talk about, Masons and Catholics, etc. But it sounds like they were just trying to organize this thing and getting the regulating patent from the office in...
We might also remember one of our speakers from last year, Ed Miller, and his discussion of the role of New Orleans in the Texas Revolution.
Right.
And those who read his book will see just how important a venue for meeting and a venue for conspiracies and a venue for plans these Masonic lodges were to bring, as Andre said before.
Emphasize the venue, though, Jim. It's not endemic to the organization.
Exactly.
It's just that they create an atmosphere in which those things can develop.
Exactly, and if some were Masonic and some were not. Some were other forms of meeting grounds in New Orleans.
Right.
But it brought those Anglo-Americans and Hispanic people together who might not have had any better way or any more convenient way.
The structure is that they're organized in grand lodges, as it's called, and they have constituent members. And you create a new lodge by receiving a charter from a grand lodge. So that the original lodges in Texas, McFarland in Houston, in San Augustine, Holland in Houston, and Milam in Nacogdoches were all originally chartered by the Grand Lodge of Louisiana.
Yeah, and you just...
which was chartered from Kentucky, which was chartered from England.
You just inadvertently corrected one slight error I heard in Andres' talk, and that was locating the Holland Lodge in San Antonio. It was, in fact, in Houston, as you just said. And in fact, when Juan Seguin came back from his long exile and apostasy, one of the first things he did was try to get himself reinstated as a Mason in San Antonio in the 1850s, where he became one of the leaders of the Democratic Party in San Antonio. And he was told by the Masons in San Antonio, well, you were a member of the Holland Lodge, and so you need to go back to the Holland Lodge to try to get your membership back again. Well, let's switch back to another very popular question, the naval questions, very popular area. And I'm not going to tell you whether the R here in Rangers is capitalized or not. We got into a big discussion in Austin at the TSHA about what a Texas Ranger was and how important it was whether the R was capitalized or not. Let me just ask this question as it came in, and I'm not going to emphasize the capitalization, and you can correct the nomenclature as you might. Did the Texas Rangers actually capture 2 vessels of the Mexican Navy? Who wants to handle that?
I can start. You have to remember that after San Jacinto, when the Texans were high-fiving each other and saying, we won, we won, we won, The Mexican government didn't exactly agree. The thing that they wanted to do was get Filisola's army turned from reverse back into drive, and one of the ways they were trying to do that, to move back from Matamoros back into East Texas, was through a supply convoy. Well, around the end of May, I believe it was the 29th of May, somewhere like that, a Texas, I'm going to say Texas Ranger, but maybe not necessarily with a capital R, a gentleman named Isaac Burton took a company of what we would probably call the early Rangers out towards Copano Bay to investigate a rumor of a Mexican supply ship or warship of some kind that was prowling in that area. They did spot a ship, turned out to be a supply ship. They managed to flag the ship down. Several of their men hid in the bushes, and when a boat came out to help the person in distress on the beach, they took over the boat, rowed it on out to the vessel, and captured it. They intended to take that vessel back to Velasco, but the winds just weren't very good for that, so they were stranded. And within a couple of weeks, 2 other supply ships came out, and they used the first ship they captured to capture the next 2. Their names were the Watchman, the Fanny Butler, and the Comanche. And so I guess I would say the answer in short is no, the ships were not part of the Mexican Navy, but they were in Mexican government service, and it was 3 of them ultimately rather than 2.
They were called Horse Marines.
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Exactly.
They were you might know more commonly the name Horse Marines, and if you go to the Handbook of Texas, the entry on that's under the Horse Marines.
Exactly. I learned about them in Texas history movies as the Horse Marines. Jerry, this is a question that you might want to answer with regard to the wreck of the Montezuma. Would it be possible to interest the TV show History's Mysteries in examining the wreck site?
I just did some work on another topic with History's Mysteries, and working on documentaries, when you approach them, they typically want you to go ahead and have something in place before they send cameras out, because it represents a tremendous outlay of capital on their part to begin collecting footage. So yeah, TV is definitely a part of our outreach strategy, but that comes into play whenever we've actually got money raised and the ability to go on site and start doing work.
Back to the Navy again. Why did James Morgan get in such trouble with his activities related to the Texas Navy? James Morgan from Morgan's Point on Galveston Bay.
Absolutely. James Morgan managed to stay on reasonably good terms with Sam Houston, and when Jim said in trouble, what that means is, as it meant to a lot of folks back then, in trouble with Sam Houston. Morgan stayed on Houston's good side until early 1843, and for a variety of reasons, the Commodore of the Texas Navy was just the one person who made Houston see red. Houston's good political sense generally left him when it came to this particular commander of the Texas Navy. Houston decided that the Navy was nothing to Texas. It really didn't have any function other than to get the bankrupt republic deeper and deeper in debt. And Houston was trying to do anything to avoid antagonizing Mexico in early 1843. He sent James Morgan out to New Orleans, where the Texas Navy was parked at the time, to bring the Navy back home so it could be sold at auction. But when James Morgan got out to New Orleans, he found the ships were in pretty good shape, and he began hearing all these stories about how the Mexican centralist government, which had been fighting a war of pacification with Yucatan, was just about to conclude an armistice with the local Yucatan governments, and then it was going to move troops against Galveston and effectively try to reconquer Texas. True or not, those stories motivated James Morgan to allow the commander of the Texas Navy to go out to Yucatan, where he fought a battle in May of 1843 against a pair of ultra-modern, state-of-the-art Mexican warships. Houston, as you can imagine, was not impressed by this little tactic. His view was he is the commander-in-chief and was the elected president, and he should be the one to decide foreign policy. So when Morgan came back when the commander of the Texas Navy came back, you can imagine the kind of hot water they got in, and that began a series of bad blood exchanges that lasted for decades.
Here's a very interesting question for Drs. Almaraz and Resendez and or others on the panel. With regard to Hispanic youth, this is from a middle school educator who says that they have several Hispanic students, usually of Mexican origin, who are confused about their identity. Are there any historical persons and or events I could refer them to so that they might better understand themselves?
Okay.
I didn't say these were going to be softballs.
I know. I do think that histories have an excellent way to root oneself, or I use it myself. Now I can see how, I mean, I don't know where these students are located exactly, but I think that going through the lives of some of these Tejanos, Mexican Texans, is very instructive. I mean, here we have people who were torn between their natural sympathies towards Mexico on the one hand, and on the other hand, their political ideals, because Mexico was itself torn between liberals and centralists. And so at some point they had to decide, do they follow their political inclination or their natural ethnic inclination? And the results are varied. So maybe that's the liberating part of this. So that would be one side of the equation. The other thing that I would tell to my students is that one tends to think of identity as a salt shaker, right? I mean, we all have one, and it's sort of like it's in somewhere in the reptilian part of your brain. You are. That's how I started on my research, and very quickly realized that people don't work that way. In the archival record, when I went there, I looked at all these Anglo-American settlers, writing to the Mexican government, and they would represent themselves as absolutely loyal to the Mexican nation. And then you go into U.S. repositories, and these are the same people that are trying to imagine themselves in a different way. So we are not one thing, but depends on who's asking and for what purpose. And so maybe that is, I mean, and we're talking about a rough and tumble environment when identity is a pretty big deal. It could be, an interesting business proposition. It could be a matter of survival. So I would go to history to demystify perhaps identity, and to see that, people have switched back and forth, and, you do the best you can in this complicated world. Yeah.
Yes.
Just very quickly, I'd add two other biographies to that to look into: Santos Benavides and J.T. Canales. If you want to look at people who have to straddle two and sometimes three worlds of loyalty, not just dealing with the Texas Revolution. Benavides is a Civil War character, and J.T. Canales is an early 20th century character who's representing the Valley in the legislature during the height of Jim Crow. There's quite a few people you can draw from to expand that dynamic.
Don Felix?
I would recommend biographical studies. I heard during the Depression the term Tejano with a little T. And around the dinner table, and I asked my mother, what does that mean? And he said, well, that meant those of us, our ancestors, meaning her great-grandfather, who was here in Texas after 1836. He said, we were Tejanos. What she was trying to tell me was that they were regionalists. And I recall in the 1960s and early 70s, when there was a lot of federal money around, that colleges and universities were inviting speakers. The University of Nebraska, more specifically the Nebraska Educational Council for Higher Education, invited, quote, ethnic speakers to come out. And so by the time I got there, they had the billboards, the press agents were out there working, and they had me listed as a a Chicano scholar, which which got the administration of one particular college a little nervous because another ethnic scholar had gotten there before and had said, "White man, I hate you." And they said, "Well, here comes this one from Texas. I wonder what he's going to say." And so they brought out all the heavy artillery. That is, those who had been former governors and had become ambassadors and had come back to Nebraska, and they had them in the amen corner, so it'd be for my lecture. And I knew that after I was already about 2/3 of the way into my lecture, one of them had fallen asleep, that they were not going to scalp me. And but one young student did ask me, sir, are you political?" And I had talked about the Texas Revolution. I wasn't talking about contemporary affairs, but he asked me, "Are you political?" I said, let me answer it this way. If you mean as a citizen of this country, am I politically concerned with what is going on today in my community, in my state, in my nation? Yes, I am political with a little p. But why are you a Chicano? I said, I don't need a label in order to identify myself. I am a human being who, by the dignity of my birth, I am a Hispanic scholar. I happen to choose history as my medium of communication. I'm an educator. But the one thing I want you to remember is be sure to call me to lunch on time.
Here's a question that occurred in my mind as you were speaking, John. Can you speak more on the origins of the Invincible as a slaver? Who built it? Who owned it? How did it come into the Texas Navy? And perhaps you or someone else on the panel might speak on the role of Texas in the illegal slave trade.
Certainly. It's a good question. The Invincible's origins are documented in its registry, which was copied and is in a booklet that's in the Texas State Library, among other places. It had the type of specifications that would be ideal for a slave trader running roughly from the Caribbean into the southern Gulf Coast particularly. The first assumption that it was built and intended for use in the slave trade came from an early history of the Texas Navy, written towards the end of the 1800s or beginning of the 1900s. So it appears that the design of the Invincible was consistent with a ship that would have been that could have been trafficking in slaves. It came into Texas hands by its purchase by the firm of McKinney & Williams, a shipping company based at the mouth of the Brazos River. They purchased the Invincible with freight on board, and back then freight on board was just a nice way of saying it's got muskets and bayonets and gunpowder and other implements of war in its hold. But they purchased it in New Orleans, made a slight markup to it, and offered to sell it to the Texas government, all told about $20,000. That's how it came to be in the hands of the Texas government. As far as the role of the slave trade in Texas, it's important to remember that at the time, whatever the ambiguity, the legal ambiguity there was about slave ownership, slave trade was, by most nations' laws, illegal at that time. In fact, it was there was a certain sense of insult for anybody to be connected with the slave trade, and when one privateer, when the capture of one privateer resulted in an argument between two early Texas patriots, James Fannin and Samuel Rhodes Fisher, Fisher accused Fannin, among the other public insults they leveled at each other, of importing slaves into that country, he said, as evidenced by their foreign dialect, showing that they had only been recently imported into Texas. So where maritime relations were concerned, that's kind of where I see the slave trade being in Texas, and maybe some of the other panelists have some thoughts in addition.
for my graduate thesis, which was on the evolution of Jim Crow in Texas, I took a look at the maritime slave trade, and it seems to have gone on. It was, of course, under Mexican law illegal, but much like the ownership of bondsmen in Texas, that's what you were if you were a slave in Mexican Texas, a bondsman, not technically a slave. It did go on, and the maritime aspect was a channel for bringing, chattel into the ports of Texas. It's not a well-documented phenomenon because of its illegal nature, but Galveston was a busy place, and the ports of entry down there were not as closely inspected. I'm sure a little American cash under the table ensured that continued to happen.
A related question is from someone who once, in reference to what was said about the Texas Revolution being the third American Revolution, any comments or examples on the global involvement in the Gulf of Mexico during the period of the Texas Revolution?
Yeah, I think I'm responsible for that one. The Third American Revolution is actually the chapter of a book that I'm writing right now on the global impact of the Texas Revolution. If you want to understand the way the world was looking at Texas at that time, you need only go to books that have been in publication for 80 or 90 years. The foreign correspondence of the Texas Revolution. You can now go to the British Library online. For about 5 years now, they've taken the archives of the British Museum and created this new agency called, I think it's called the British Library. They now have indexes to their collection online. Just put in Texas sometime, or go to the Times of London or the New York Times online, put in Texas, and see what you get. You get a lot of names you've never heard of. People like Samuel Swartout and William Christie become very important in that correspondence. And you get a sense that there are a whole bunch of ships from various countries parked down in New Orleans and in Galveston Bay that seem to be doing nothing more than floating around and looking at Texas. You also find a year later, the Texas Revolution mentions in newspapers in places like South Africa. Clearly, Texas was one of the first republics to emerge on the face of the planet, and anyone with a revolutionary bent was looking at us as an example of what could be done in the face of monarchy or in the face of colonialism. So again, there's a lot of research that's already out there. There's some that we're only scratching the surface of, but that phrase, the Third American Revolution, is going to be a chapter in a book that hopefully will be out sometime soon.
John, I know in your book you mentioned the British activity. Is there anything you'd want to add to what Jerry just said?
No, I think that was an excellent summary. You have to remember that at the time, England was not perfectly happy with the United States like it was after World War II. There was some tension over the U.S.-Canadian border, for instance. America was an emerging power, and during the Republic years, the last thing Great Britain wanted to see was the United States swallow up another section of the continent. If nothing else, Texas was a wonderful market for cotton that could be imported into England as an economic counterweight to the cotton farms of America. So there were a lot of international implications, and many of them were driven by the almighty pound sterling.
Here's a lighthearted question, not necessarily a softball, for Dr. Resendez. As a professor at University of California at Davis, you must know what grape varietals were cultivated in Texas in 1836. Which ones were they? Maybe
Well,
that was a curveball.
That's a very tough one. And I must say that I know the statistics. I know that Californians drink 3 times as much wine as people from other states. But I can tell you that even Californians are beginning to be curious about things like the Longhorn Chablis and things like that. So we look forward to that.
Dr. Almaraz, and perhaps Andres too, with regarding pamphleteering, could you elaborate on any similarities with the American Revolution, committees of correspondence? Could there be contemporaries of Samuel Adams regarding the Mexican-Texan Revolution? Could Los Guadalupes parallel perhaps the Sons of Liberty, and is there a Boston Tea Party for Los Guadalupes?
No, I think there was more of rather a stronger connection in the first decade of the 19th century when pamphleteers went into Baltimore, and they were from the Caribbean area. They were looking for full employment opportunities as filibusters, and pamphleteering became a way of trying to propagandize their objectives, or try to get recruits, try to get investors. Alvarez de Toledo, Jose Alvarez de Toledo, whose nationality is difficult to pinpoint. Was he from Puerto Rico? Was he from Cuba? Was he from the Dominican area? We don't know, but he was an adventurer. He was very active in Boston in the 1810s and into the next decade, rather that particular decade. And he was pamphleteering, and he sent bundles down to Louisiana to take advantage of the neutral ground in order to promote armies to gather in there. And so you had then that aspect in Texas history of the filibusters, the filibusteros, which became, I guess, a code word for pirates, horse thieves, stargazers, anyone who just would be willing to shed their national identity and go find opportunities elsewhere. And Santa Anna, when he was a young lieutenant who came to Texas in 1813 and who participated at the Battle of the Medina, heard his general say that, this is Joaquin Arredondo, anyone who comes into Texas for purposes of destabilizing the government, armed in a territory of a friendly power adjacent to Spanish territory, if caught, will be executed as a filibustero, as a pirate. Well, what were they using? They were using pamphlets as a way of trying to recruit, trying to get their objectives, and there you have a blend then of pamphleteers and filibusteros. Perhaps, Dr. Resendez would like to comment on another aspect of this phenomenon.
Can you hear me?
You need to be close to the mic.
Okay. What I would like to do is, I'm fascinated by these pamphlets, and as Dr. Almaraz left very clear, everybody who was somebody in Mexico, the first thing you do if you're a politician is to secure a printing press and somebody to operate that, and that was what you did if you were a military leader, a clergyman of some aspirations, etc. But in addition to that, you have to wonder just how many people in Mexico actually read. And so in addition to the pamphlets, what I would like to do is to also call your attention that there was a literary world out there that did not depend necessarily on people being able to read and write. For example, what I discovered is that some of the way the Spanish and then the Mexican government worked was by copying some of the orders. And then the orders themselves had some instruction below saying, this is going to be nailed down on the church door or, on the main square and read aloud every other Sunday at 11 o'clock for 2 months. This is what happened with the Texans are coming. This is what New Mexico did, during when the army of Texans in 1841-42 were coming to claim half of New Mexico. There were all of these orders affixed on the squares in various towns in New Mexico, and that's how the New Mexicans were so worked up about these. So when this starving group of Texans showed up, they were absolutely shocked because they were expecting for months this incredible army that would come here. So this just to make the point that there was this other literary world, that there are literary worlds, and that these texts produce their own cultures of how they were consumed. And certainly pamphlets is one, but there were others that informed people. And the last kind of thing that I think you rightfully pointed to is that there were very few newspapers in Texas. There was a very lively Texas newspaper scene in the 1850s and 60s and 70s. But if you go back to the 1820s and 10s, you discover that there was nothing published in Texas. But there was a lively journalistic world of stuff being published in New Orleans by some of the most radical newspapermen anywhere that were publishing their stuff in New Orleans, where they were absolutely untouchable from the government of Mexico, and then sent back to Coahuila and Texas, et cetera, et cetera. So thanks.
During this period, there was a U.S., his title was a special agent, William Shaler. And for a number of years, we Texas historians wondered, well, what was his role in encouraging filibusters with the use of pamphlets? Well, they found some materials over at the archives of the College of William and Mary, and the scholar who then was editing these. I never knew who the scholar was, because they just sent the manuscript to me to comment as to whether they would be useful as a source of information. Definitely. So I didn't agree with the thesis that William Shaler was the prototype of the CIA. And I said, intelligence gathering, yes. That was the era. This had been going on in the late 18th century. Nations were sending out scientists to gather information about other friendly powers. And Shaler was an active agent of the State Department. He was in Louisiana supplying pamphlets in order to encourage the partisans whom he favored. Later he ended up in California and was over in China doing the same thing, using pamphlets as a way of spreading the good word about whatever policy the United States wanted to promote.
Someone earlier mentioned Dr. James Grant, also known as Diego Grant, the Coahuilan rancher, who was very deeply involved in first the Federalist civil wars in Mexico in 1834-35, and then in the Texas Revolution. He's that man who drained the Alamo of material and men and took them down towards that Matamoros expedition. The Texas A&M University Press has accepted a manuscript, which will be published in a year or so, called The War for Texas, by Dr. Grant's great-great-great-great-grandson, a Scottish scholar by the name of Stuart Reid. And in using both family documents and records from the British Foreign Office, Stuart Reid has a very good case that Dr. James Grant was a British agent, and that the whole Matamoros expedition was an effort to pull Texas out of the United States orbit and to organize what Grant and others even persuaded men like Fannin and Austin would be a good idea in the fall and winter of 1835, and that is creating a North Mexican Confederation, including Texas and with the other North Mexican Federalist states. And it's exactly what a British agent would be doing. The American agent who went down to South Texas to try to head this off was, of course, Sam Houston. That silenced the room. But if you read Sam's letter from Natchitoches that he wrote in early 1833, after he'd been in Texas for a few months, it is very clear that he is acting in the interest of bringing Texas into the American Union. This is the letter he wrote to President Jackson. Stepped over the border, wrote his letter in Natchitoches. I don't think he wanted that to be read by the Mexican officials. But I think there's no question that whether official or unofficial, and Jackson was too smart to make it official, that Sam Houston's acting as an American agent. His lodestar, as John Jordan has made clear in his book on the Lone Star Navy, was to get Texas into the United States. And Houston said this over and over and over again, both while Texas was part of Mexico. Secretly, he said that, and then while it was independent.
Dr. Crisp, let me make one point on that to agree with you. What flag was the pocket flying when it was captured? The United States flag. A Navy on the high seas has very, very broad jurisdiction to engage and capture the enemy. The United States Merchant Marine was trafficking in goods to Mexico. It is very dangerous for American ships to be captured on the high seas by the Texas Navy if your project is to bring Texas into the United States. It's another motivation for why Houston did not want a far-ranging navy with broad authority running up and down the coast.
And Houston also wanted, if I could just steal a bit of John's thunder, Houston wanted Texas to look weak in 1843. He wanted Texas to look weak because he wanted the British and Americans to be deciding who was going to go in and rescue Texas. And he wanted the United States especially to fear that Texas might have to throw itself into the arms of the British Lion, and for Morgan and Commodore Moore to go down and whip some Mexican butt off the coast of Campeche was not in line with the bigger plan. Sam Houston was able to see 3 or 4 moves ahead of most other people, both when he was president and when he was the general of the Texas Army. And he's thinking big picture when a lot of other people are thinking heroics. And that's one of the reasons he's probably one of my favorite people. Let me ask you a couple more questions. We're not going to get to all those, but here are a couple that, again, speak to this issue of multiple identities. Were all the Mexican soldiers fluent in Spanish? The answer is no, certainly. And who would like to give a quick answer to that? I'll handle it myself if you'd like, or
Sure.
so. Well, there were several Yucatecan units who were impressed into the Mexican army in Yucatan who were not fluent in Spanish. It's important to know that when Mexico achieved its independence in 1821, probably half of the people in Mexico could not speak Spanish. Is that about right? Is that close enough?
Maybe a little less, maybe 30% or something
30?
like that. There's a significant indigenous population there of many languages, many of whom were drafted and brought to the north.
Certainly,
Yeah.
the first language was of half, perhaps, was not Spanish.
Yeah, right.
And a related question here was, what about Mexican foreign officers? Well, in my tracking Hermann Ehrenberg, the Texan private who was a German, one of the persons that he talks about most in his memoir is, I think it's Colonel Juan Jose Holtzinger, who was a Catholic Rhine Prussian in the Mexico. Is it? I'm sorry? Juan Jose Holtzinger. Yeah, well, it's like Diego Grant, you know. Sure. It's like Esteban Austin, sure. You know, you do as the Romans do. Yeah. And his son, Holtzinger, also, another Holtzinger, also fought in the war with the United States. But Holtzinger was a Mexican engineer who spoke fluent German because he was German, just as Ehrenberg was. And they had a number of conversations, probably not as many as Ehrenberg claimed in his memoirs. But he was very much one of those folks. So, and goodness, if you read Lone Star Navy, you'll see. I keep plugging John's book because it's so good. You see these British and Americans serving in the Mexican Navy, the Texan Navy, the Yucatecan Navy. These guys are professionals above almost anything else.
Can I just make one last quick addition to that, and that is a little more ethereal, but in the 1820s, when you read sources, Mexican sources, they speak about Americanos del Norte and Mexicans and Americanos also to refer to Mexicans. So there is this kinship as two sister republics in a sea of monarchical despotism. And there's this kinship that disappears in the 1830s, but it is important to recognize that there was this early rapprochement, as it were, between Mexicans and Americans, and there is this cosmopolitan world that would later cease to be.
Yeah, the idea of being a liberal republic is a big, radical, important deal in the 1820s. And there's a great deal of communal feeling across those lines that we now see as much more hard and rigid national lines. I gave Jeff Dunn a technical question that he's going to ask when he gets up here, and then I apologize to all of those who asked questions that we couldn't get to, but here's one other one that I'm going to throw at Jeff. I know he'll be able to answer this. If Osama bin Laden flashed a Masonic sign, would George Bush protect him? Oh, one more thing, if I may. If you would like us to sign your books, if we've written a book you'd like us to sign, if you'd like us to sign someone else's books, we will be up here at the front table and do that for as long as we're able to stand it. Thank you very much.
Let's give a big round of applause to Jim Crisp and all our speakers. I think we had a fantastic symposium this year. Thank you so much. And